Want to say thank you to our next guest who's joining us in studio. Grant Loebs joins us on a monthly basis and spends a little bit of time with us talking about legal issues. In fact, he's in the studio with us at the moment, 9:07. You're listening to Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com, and this is Top Story. 45 at our studio, seem to be just hanging in at that temperature somewhat consistently this morning. Grant, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you.
We were just talking about this story that's up on our monitor that we're looking at right now about this fellow named, is it Robert Durst?
Yeah, Robert Durst.
What the heck did...
Quite a character, isn't he?
But to open his mouth on an open... We were just talking about open microphones, too, but this fellow managed apparently to... We don't know. He's not convicted yet, but for 30 years he's been holding some secrets. And then to all of a sudden just blurt something out.
Well, and, of course, he was tried for a murder in Texas, which he was acquitted of. And a lot of people find that curious because he not only killed this guy, but dismembered his body and dragged his body parts and threw him in Galveston Bay. But, of course, the Texas jury found him not guilty by reason of they believed it was self-defense. But so then he decides and he's also been a suspect in the murder of this woman for a long time. And then he decides he's going to do an HBO series where he's going to talk about the fact that he's been a suspect of murder and that he's been tried for murder. And I guess he decided to talk about it while he was in the men's room, while he was still mic'd up, which doesn't make a lot of sense.
That's like that scene.
He looks like a bit of a crazy guy. I mean, just watching him on TV, but...
Yeah, you know what he reminds me of? Because there was the wrestling coach, who was one of the DuPonts.
Yeah.
Who ended up dying in prison a few years ago.
Which they recently made that movie about.
Right, with Steve Carell, right?
Yeah.
In the main role. And you got these people, and I don't know, maybe it's the sense of entitlement they grow up with.
He looks like he's just having fun playing a game to me. It's a pretty high stakes game, but it's really bizarre. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how this develops.
In fact, his family, from what I understand, one of the commentaries I saw Sunday said that his family owns most of the New York City skyline. I mean, there's some tremendous wealth and real estate investments that they have, and he doesn't fit, I guess, the profile of someone you would call a serial killer.
Well, I don't know that there is any way to determine who is and who isn't a serial killer or a killer of any kind. I mean, murder is a very peculiar and unique thing. Powerful people want somebody out of the way as much as sometimes not, just regular citizens. And whether this is something that he did, and of course we don't know that he did it yet, but the theory is that this woman was going to be a witness against him for the other thing. So I don't know. We'll watch and see. But it's hard to look at somebody and peg whether they're capable of a crime like that.
I believe we have a caller with us on the program. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story. Grant Loebs is our guest during this hour of the program. My name is Bill Colley, and the telephone number 736-0300. I believe we have a caller with us. You're on the air with Grant Loebs.
Good morning, Grant. I would like to ask you a question. Up to what point does free speech is protected? Like, for example, if I say something and it causes other people to react in a negative way and there's a victim involved in it, is that a crime or not?
Well, if you just say something, probably not. I mean, I would need to have more detail about that, about what you said and in what situation.
Like, for example, what happened to the editor of The Opinion, that he got his tires slashed. And when there's people yelling and insulting him, doesn't that entice people to react negative towards him and probably commit a crime like slash his tires and stuff like that?
Because he wrote something in an editorial?
No, because there's somebody always antagonizing him, harassing him, and telling him stuff like that. Is it a crime for the person that entices? Is it just like yelling fire in the theater or not?
Well, as you say, it's against the law to yell fire in a theater because you're causing a public panic. But if you just say controversial things and people dislike what you say, then no, you're not guilty of enticing them. If I'm a editorial writer for the Times News and I write an editorial that I know is going to anger a good number of people in my community, that doesn't mean it's okay to come after me with pitchforks and torches. The question is very general, and the answer has to be specific based on what specifically happens.
Wasn't there a case, and I know the Southern Poverty Law Center was involved with it some years ago, with some white supremacists, and it ended up bankrupting their organization. Someone had been killed, and the feeling was that they had generated, through their rhetoric, the motivation for the killers in that particular case.
Well, generating the motivation and making it legitimate are two different things. I mean, you may generate motivation for somebody to come after you any given day, given what you say, but that doesn't mean it's legitimate for them to do that.
Right.
That's kind of the basic tenet of free speech. I mean, you get to say pretty much whatever you want in this country, provided that it doesn't, cause other people some harm. And, if you express a controversial opinion, people can't come after you for it.
His reference, though, to the, and it's probably, I guess, the most well-known reference in this situation, yelling fire in a crowded movie house, that there are limits when you get to something like that.
Sure, because that causes obvious harm. It causes panic, and it's not free speech. I mean, you're not discussing whether you believe that movie houses should have extra fire protection or something. I mean, you're just doing that, purely to incite. And if you say things that incite a riot, for instance, that can be a crime. You had the guy in Ferguson who was yelling for people to burn the town, and there were calls for him to be arrested for inciting a riot. So it's possible that speech that you say that you make that causes direct harm to people can be punishable, but that doesn't mean that if you express a controversial opinion that people have a right to come after you and say, well, you had it coming.
There are some people who believe that some of the anger in Ferguson and the calls for burning the city down were amplified by media coverage. And we talked the last time you were here, just as you got off the air. Since the days of the Simpson trial, there's been some concern about media coverage of various criminal cases, and sometimes that maybe the media itself has, unfortunately, whether it's not intended, but unfortunately sort of fed into all of this. And that's got to be a concern if you're in the business you are, that you've always got to be vigilant about what's going on around you like that.
Well, that's true. And the media, whether they're doing their job responsibly or whether they're trying to just be sensational, the media is a challenge for people in my business and for police, because we have a duty to make sure that a person gets a fair trial, and sometimes media coverage will make that difficult. And there are all kinds of rules about what police can say, what prosecutors can say, and as long as the prosecutor or the police don't say anything that feeds into this sensationalism, as long as we're careful about what we say about a case. For instance, you asked me, and before that, Kelly asked me many times about ongoing cases, and I can say very little about a case that's ongoing. And the reason for that is not because it's necessarily being kept secret, because you might know the facts that you're asking me to comment about, but because it's not my job to feed into a media trial and conviction of a person before all the facts are known. But sometimes the media will do that without my comment or without the police comment. And there are rules that govern when a person gets a new trial or a change of venue or something like that. And we have to be very careful that comments that we make aren't part of that. So there may be big banner headlines about a case, and there may be extensive coverage about a trial, and that is okay. It doesn't necessarily take away from a person's right to a fair trial. But if those headlines are based on something I say and something I do, then that becomes another matter.
In fact, I saw a judge one time nearly lose his office because he made a comment about how he felt that Dominican immigrants were causing nothing but headaches for the criminal justice system in his courtroom, packing it, inferring that they had caused a rise in crime in the area. And it was an offhand comment, but media used it because it's like someone dropped a gift in their hands. And unfortunately, a lot of cases ended up going to the Court of Appeals and getting sent back because of that.
Right, and that's a different problem because that may indicate a bias on the part of that judge. But if I were to go on a press conference today and talk about how X crime is the worst crime I've ever seen, and this guy's the worst defendant I've ever seen, and what he did was just horrible, and we're going to do everything we can to do as much as possible to put him away forever, that would be a significant problem because the publicity generated by that would be unfair publicity that I caused. If you, however, as an editorialist, were to go on the air and say exactly those same things, it wouldn't necessarily cause a change of venue to be legitimate or a new trial or anything like that because you're just a citizen speaking your opinion. But when I speak, people will assume that I know something that they don't know and that I'm, speaking from a position of authority. And in addition to that, I'm supposed to be, giving this person a fair trial. So you have all kinds of problems when officials say these things that you don't have when a citizen says them because the citizen has the right to express his opinion on those things.
We have a break coming up in a minute, but I want to try to get a caller at least to get an opportunity to get a question out. 918, we'll call it 46 at our studios, News Radio 1310 KLIX. And, of course, joining us in studio, Grant Loebs, the prosecutor for Twin Falls County, and you're on the air.
Glenn, Bill, hello. I was just going to say that a prime example of is our president giving for law, like saying what the case is before they even know. It isn't just the media, it's the president, too. He's done it several times.
The one that sticks out in my mind would be after the Skip Gates case in Boston or Massachusetts. And perhaps I think the president, in retrospect, realized that he might have gone a little too far on that one.
Well, I don't know whether he did or not because he then did the same thing in the Trayvon Martin case and he did the same thing in Ferguson. So I'm not sure that he did realize it. And the president, of course, is in a different position, than I am in that he is not responsible for prosecution of these cases. It's not healthy for somebody of that significance to make those kind of comments publicly. I think the bigger problem, if you're looking for an example, a big example like that, is some of the Attorney General's comments during the Ferguson investigation. But again, he isn't the prosecutor for that case either. But there are pretty strict rules about what a prosecutor can say about a pending case.
We've got more with Grant Loebs coming up 20 after 9. 46 at our studios. This is Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. 23 minutes after 9 o'clock. Grant Loebs is our guest in this hour of the program. Twin Falls County Prosecutor. 924. 46 is our temperature. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We were just having an off-air discussion about the Simpson trial. It's 2 decades now. Time really flies by. But for a lot of people who'd grown up on Perry Mason, the Simpson trial was a different animal. It maybe was a little slower and showed them it's not quite always as dramatic in court. But I was referencing, I knew a judge in Cattaraugus County, New York. I'd grown up with a lot of his family members, and I was working at the time as a television news director, and a big case came up in his county, and he was adamant he did not want cameras in his courtroom because he said after seeing what had happened a couple of years earlier at the Simpson trial, he thought it would harm justice. And his rationale, I think, was the fact that if you brought cameras in on this particular case, the case long escapes my mind, but that it would influence the outcome, and he didn't want that happening.
It can certainly influence the way people behave. I mean, if you know that you're speaking to a room full of people, it's different than if you know that you're speaking to 20 million people who are watching on television. And I think that cameras can make a witness behave differently, certainly can make judges and prosecutors and defense lawyers behave differently. And we have cameras in the courtroom in Twin Falls County. Idaho now has a rule that allows a judge to grant a request for cameras in the courtroom. There are rules about what they can film. They can't film usually the victims. They can't. I think, it depends on what the judge says. They can't film the witness while they're testifying sometimes. And I haven't seen a big problem with it here, but rarely when we're on camera in Twin Falls do we think that the whole nation is watching us either. So I think that was a function of both the cameras and just the general media circus that followed the Simpson trial, and the fact that all those people were made celebrities. I mean, from the judge to the prosecutors to the defense lawyers to some of the witnesses. I mean, Cato Kalin, who is this guy? But he's suddenly a household name, and he relished it. So I think that part of the problem was just the confluence of the celebrity of the defendant, the media circus that surrounded it, and then the cameras in the courtroom for the whole trial.
From a prosecutorial vantage point, Darden and Clark never looked like they were comfortable with all of that going on.
No, I'm sure they weren't. And of course, depending upon who they were, there were so many defense attorneys involved in that. Some of them were very theatrical, and some of them just looked like they wanted to do their job. I'm sure some of them weren't very comfortable with it either. Yeah, I mean, that has to be the worst case scenario. That case, I don't know of one that's been as bad as that. We've had many publicized trials since then, and I don't think that the effect of the cameras has been as great.
I think that, but in most cases, you put a camera in a courtroom, the public, if they watch any more than a television, will uses a little short, soundbite. But if the public sees most of the action going on, it's a lot drier than Perry Mason. And I don't think the public really, in this day and age of video games and fast-paced editing, really can keep up with it, or will have the patience to keep up with it.
Certainly not to watch the whole thing. I mean,
right.
You're going to get highlights, and that's that's what the news generally provides, a little snippet, a judge giving the sentence, a prosecutor asking for the sentence, a particularly dramatic moment in testimony. That's about all you're going to get. And even if the camera's there all day, I know that only 30 seconds of footage are going to be on the news. And I haven't seen a big negative to having the cameras in the courtroom the way they're done in Idaho.
I think that going back to the Lindbergh baby kidnapping trial, that I remember reading that there were people selling souvenirs outside the courtroom, and that probably was the first time and should have foreshadowed some of the Simpson case, because again, perhaps somebody in the courtroom sitting on the bench should have said, enough of that, get those people out of here.
Yeah, I don't know that they were doing it in the courtroom, but certainly it was it surrounded the court. I mean, that probably was the real trial of the century, and then the Simpson thing became the trial of the century again because of the publicity and the fact that you could watch it on TV. But the Lindbergh case, riveted the whole nation to the radio, to the newspapers, to every word that was written about it.
So now I haven't covered courts now in over 20 years, but I can remember a lot of homicide cases. If they lasted longer than 1 week, they were usually the longest, but they would last a week and then they'd be over with. But the Simpson case dragged on for a year, and I could never quite figure out why that didn't wrap so compared to what I was seeing in my own personal life.
It's hard to imagine a case going that long. I can't imagine how that happens. Our longest cases in Idaho, criminal cases, are usually 2-3 weeks, 4 weeks at the most. I can't imagine doing a case that lasted months and months.
Then again, they're not hiring the dream team of lawyers.
And keeping the jury attention, too.
We have more coming up with Grant Loebs. He's in studio with us until just before 10 o'clock this morning. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Our guest in the studio joining us this morning, Grant Loebs. I always refer to you as Twin Falls County Prosecutor because it's easier for me, but we've talked about this before. Depending on what part of the country you're in, your job has a different title.
Right. In Idaho, we're prosecuting attorneys, and each county has one. And in other states, they go by several different names, and sometimes they have districts that encompass many counties, or sometimes even parts of a county. So it all depends on how the setup is in that state.
If you watched a lot of Law and Order, New York City, because it's so big geographically, is actually several counties merged into one city, which is the opposite of what most people would think. So they have separate. There's always references, in fact, in that show to Brooklyn having a distinct district attorney,
Right.
and Manhattan having a distinct district attorney, but they're actually county district attorneys. But there's what, 6 or 7 subdivisions in that city.
Right. Right.
And then I think the other, in a small state such as Delaware, where I was working before I came here, because you only have 3 counties, the Attorney General's office handles all prosecutions.
Right. They don't have any individual prosecutors. It's just the Attorney General's office, which means, of course, they have a bigger office than most, but it's all handled centrally by one Attorney General and his deputies.
The work, though, I would imagine everywhere is very much the same, and as dramatic as it may have looked with Sam Waterston, there's a lot of late night hard work, and it's just not as glamorous maybe as TV.
Yeah, I mean, in order to make my job that glamorous, we would have to take very careful, very specific cuts and link them together, and you'd have to wait a long time to get enough footage to do that. Most of the work is, just like any other desk job. It's day-to-day work. You have to do the things that need to be done to make sure that your case is prepared, and you never see the Law and Order guys preparing their case. You hear them talking about it sometimes, the dramatic parts of it, but the courtroom scenes are never as interesting as they are on TV, and that's a good thing. But it takes a lot more time, obviously, in real life to do a case than it does for a television show or even a series, because they just show essentially the results and a few dramatic things. But that's the way it is with any show any profession they make a show out of. Police work isn't nearly as exciting as it is on a police show, and it's all dramatic license.
Ken Menzel was in studio a few weeks ago from the Sheriff's Department, and he was saying that there has been a recent spike in DUI cases, which, of course, your office deals with a lot of those. Here we are on March 17th, often referred to by people in law enforcement as amateur night. There is a good likelihood that by tomorrow morning you're going to have another long list of those cases.
Well, if history's any guide, we will. St. Patrick's Day is one of the biggest drinking days of the year, right up there with New Year's Eve, 4th of July. And if there are people out there thinking it's going to be a fun night, well, I hope it is. But if it's going to be a fun night and you're going to drink a lot and you're going to be out at a bar and then you're going to think, I can probably get home without causing an accident, think again, take a cab, because you might be able to get home, you think, without causing an accident. But obviously the police are going to be out in force to protect the community from people who are drinking too much. There are going to be a lot of people out who have had too much to drink, probably beginning fairly early in the evening.
This is one of those jobs that you have where you don't necessarily go looking for new business. In fact, if you had a quiet night tonight,
I would be happy with a quiet night.
Right.
We don't need a dozen new DUI cases tonight, and neither does the city prosecutor, I'm sure. We're always happy if there's less crime.
You see, though, I would assume a lot of these people that this is their first time in the system. But unfortunately, after something like this happens to them, and it's very costly for them legally, it often is part of a bigger downward spiral, isn't it?
Well, maybe. The problem is it may be your first time in the system, but it's probably not your first time doing something. If you're a person who's going to be caught driving drunk tonight, odds are it's not the very first time in your life you ever did it. It's possible that it is. And, it will cost, if you're arrested, it will cost you a lot of money. If you have to hire a lawyer, it will cost you a lot of money. If you're convicted, it will cost you a lot. Insurance will cost you a lot. after you're convicted of a DUI. So it's just it's really not worth it. It's not worth getting even close.
And of course, some of the worst things that happen too, where you end up with, unfortunately, some fatalities because of drinking and driving, then people are in some really serious trouble.
Oh, absolutely. Then you change a DUI to a manslaughter, and then obviously the punishment goes way up. But the harm to both yourself and to the community and to your victim go way up too. And when you're intoxicated and you're driving, it's just a matter of time before you do something even worse than the actual drunk driving.
We've got more coming up with Grant Loebs, Twin Falls County Prosecutor. It's 20 minutes now from 10 o'clock, 47 at our studios. This is Top Story with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Our guest in the studio, Grant Loebs. He's the Twin Falls County Prosecutor. Coming up on 9:44, 47 is our temperature. Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. If this guy was a prosecutor, you wouldn't have much crime at all, would you, if Darth Vader was in that role?
Yeah, I don't think that they had a very good legal system from what I saw.
Yes, he was rather direct. Yeah. Crime.
I've never heard that lead-in music before, though.
There's no due process involved in his courtroom.
Not so much.
Right. We were talking a little earlier about some general issues with the law, and of course you can reach the program today at 736-0300. That is 736-0300 if you've got a question for the prosecutor today. We were talking off air, and of course certain cases you just cannot talk about while they're ongoing. But the one thing that's we'll get back to that. We'll get to our caller first. We have a caller joining us on the air at 9:45 now, and you're up next. Good morning.
Hi. Am I on?
All right, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hey, I've got a question for you guys. How do you deal with the vagaries in the law? For instance, the concealed carry law, where it states that you can conceal carry without a permit outside of an urban area while engaging in an outdoor activity. How do you rectify that? I'm going to hang up.
Well, that's an interesting question, and the legislature, of course, is in the midst of trying to amend the concealed carry law in Idaho. The way it's written right now, it says that you can carry a concealed weapon if you're engaged in a lawful outdoor activity, and hunting and fishing and hiking and those things are clearly anticipated by that. But the problem is that when you're enforcing the law, and when you're enforcing the law against citizens who say, "Hey, I read the law, and the law said lawful outdoor activity. I was riding my bicycle. I was picnicking. I was standing outside talking to my neighbor." I mean, none of those are unlawful outdoor activities. So I think it would be very difficult for a prosecutor to try to prosecute somebody who was engaged in pretty much any lawful outdoor activity, meaning any activity that's not unlawful, if they had a concealed weapon under the current statute. There's a concept in the law where something is void for vagueness. The legislature has the obligation, when they write a law, to make it clear enough that the average person, when they read the law, can understand what is prohibited. And so the caller asks a question about a specific statute which has been perplexing and sometimes amusing to prosecutors for a long time. And that is, when could I prosecute you for having a concealed weapon when you're outside the city limits, or outside, as the statute says, a logging or mining community? The answer is, I can only prosecute you if you're engaged in an illegal outdoor activity while you have the concealed weapon, because almost anything you do outdoors can be legal. I mean, walking, talking, standing, stargazing, all those are lawful outdoor activities. So I would err on the side of giving the citizen the benefit of the doubt, because the statute is quite unclear.
We have Mike Huckabee coming up in just a couple of minutes, but just quickly to mention, Huckabee's report is brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls, 736-6563. Just very quickly, when we talk about crimes that come up in Twin Falls and Twin Falls County, for the size of this community, my surprise has been how few serious violent crimes there are. It must be a cultural thing, because I have seen smaller cities where the crime rates and the homicide rates are considerably higher.
Well, I think that's true in Idaho in general. Idaho has a very low crime rate, and there have been a lot of talk back and forth, use of statistics, and sometimes use of sleight of hand to discuss, our prison population and our incarceration rates, and none of those are as high as they've been claimed to be. But the one thing that everybody agrees on is Idaho has a very low crime rate, and that is a good thing. And messing with our laws to the point where we change that would be a bad idea. But Twin Falls has actually a little higher crime rate than the average in Idaho. But in Idaho, there are only 5 or 6 or 7 things that you would call even remotely urban areas, and Twin Falls is one of those. But we are at the center of a couple of interstates and a major north-south road, and so that encourages extra crime here, as does the fact that we are the population center for a wide geographic area. So people come to town, and on the weekends our city and our county are a lot bigger than they are during the week. But that having been said, you're right, especially coming from back east. A city the size of Twin Falls in another state, an eastern state, would have a much larger crime rate than we do now here.
We've got Mike Huckabee coming up in just a moment, and we had a telephone caller as well. But if you'd like, Grant Loebs will be with us for a couple more minutes following the Huckabee report. And if you've got a question or comment, you can pass that along to him in just a few minutes. I want to thank Governor Huckabee very much for his time this morning, and if you check out the Washington Examiner website this morning, you will see Governor Huckabee making some comments there on a particular story. We'll talk about it maybe tomorrow. Very scathing comments about some political activities in Washington. Meanwhile, we're wrapping up this edition of the program on Top Story with Grant Loebs, our Twin Falls County Prosecutor. He has been in the studio with us graciously for the hour. And we had a caller who was looking to reach him. We've got a couple of minutes left. If you still have a question or comment for the prosecutor, give us a shout at 736-0300. This is News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And my name is Bill Colley. Rush Limbaugh coming up following news at 10 o'clock. You pointed out, obviously, that there are stories you cannot go into too much depth about, but you do have some trials coming up sometime soon on a couple of homicide cases.
Well, on the one, we have some preliminary hearings coming up, and that's, of course, the first step before a trial, and you have to get through the preliminary hearing first. And then there was another incident just recently where the police did have a press statement in the paper today looking for information. So that case has not yet been solved.
I was going to say, has anyone ever walked into a courtroom and caught you by surprise and said, I did it, and I think it's time that I admitted it? And
it's like on Perry Mason?
Yeah.
No.
It doesn't happen in real life, does it?
I mean, a lot of people obviously confess to crimes and plead guilty, but I've never had anybody who just out of the blue said, hey, it was me after all. I mean, there's so much time. See, in the TV show, that all happens in an hour.
Right.
But in real life, they're a suspect, they're charged, they go through a preliminary hearing, they go through motions, trial comes up. So sure, during that period of time, there are a lot of people who contact my office and say they want to plead guilty, but it's never as dramatic as in the movies.
I just know that I talked to a police officer friend one time, and he's now working with the sheriff's department in Florida, and I remember him telling me that he had to really search his memory banks, because he said in rare instances there had been people who said when he stopped them or he talked to them, they said they came out and said, I did it, and I have to be honest. But he said for the most part he was in a job where he felt that the coming into a job like that, you knew people were going to be lying to you a lot. And unfortunately, that's human nature.
Yeah. Well, that's true, but a lot of people, of course, do admit what they did initially to police, and sometimes that leads to a fairly quick case and a quick guilty plea where they may get some concessions for the fact that they're willing to plead or they're willing to take responsibility. But oftentimes, we have to fight about whether that was a valid confession and whether it was a willing confession and whether it comes into evidence.
I think a guy saying, I killed them all into an open microphone, he probably at this point has pretty much sealed his fate.
Well, that's going to be pretty dramatic evidence if it gets in, and it looks to me from the very little I've seen that it's likely to get in. I mean, I don't see any exception that would keep that out. But again, what was he exactly meaning when he said it? We don't know till we watch the trial.
It's true. Anyway, thank you. We'll see you in about a month or so.
Thank you.
Grant Loebs joining us in studio. Twin Falls County Prosecutor, 9:58. Rush Limbaugh following Fox News. This is Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. My name is Bill Colley, and God willing, and the creek don't rise, I'm back here tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock.